Hi, Jane.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
It's been a
How are you?
while.
It's been a very long time. I don't even want to think about how long it's been, actually.
We should explain. First of all, you are Jane McDonnell, Executive Director of the Online News Association, which is relevant to the discussion we're going to have. We'll talk about that a little. But also, you and I go way back. We were together at a small newspaper in New Jersey in the early 1980s. Although I know neither of us looks as if we could have even been born by then. It is, it is in fact the case. Um, so what I want to do, this is like an experiment in broadcasting or something, because what I wanted to try to do is, after you tell us a little bit about what you do at the Online News Association, although astute Blogging Heads viewers may remember that you've already done some of that on Blogging Heads, so we won't spend too much time on. I wanted to reminisce a little about life back then in the pre-internet age of journalism and compare it to life now in with digital journalism, which is what your organization is all about, and see if we can come to some conclusion about whether it's a better world or a worse world or none of the above. Um, Before we sink into reminisce mode, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at the Online News Association? And I should say that you get some support from the Democracy Fund. We've gotten some support for the Democracy Fund for this series, in fact, that this conversation is part of, called Democracy in America. With that as prelude, why don't you tell us a little bit about what the Online News Association does?
Sure. And I have to thank the Democracy Fund for bringing us together again.
It never would have happened.
That's right. That's right. So the Online News Association is a nonprofit membership organization for digital journalists. We have about 2,400 members now, but we kind of consider the journalism community our audience, not just our members.
Mm-hmm.
What I do basically is just oversee all of the strategy, the budget, working with the board of directors and staff for the organization. It's pretty simple.
So digital journalists all over America and maybe the world, they join. They pay relatively small, not exorbitant dues, I would say, and they get benefits in the way of networking and access to information about how to do their job, what jobs are available, and that kind of stuff, I gather.
Yeah, all that. Plus, we do support via scholarships and fellowships.
Mm-hmm.
We're very big at the intersection of journalism and technology. So that's essentially what we try to support and sort of unearth and highlight too.
Okay. Now let's talk about the old days. Uh, we worked at a newspaper called the Daily Register. It was more commonly known as the Red Bank Register, even though it was no longer in Red Bank per se by the time we were there. It was on the Jersey Shore.
It was.
And I always thought it would have made a good situation comedy, that newsroom.
I think they made it.
Did they?
Jersey Shore.
Well, there's that.
Yeah.
I wasn't too much into the Jersey Shore scene. I don't think I knew a single person named like Vinny or.
I did.
You did.
I,
Well, you were kind of local, weren't you?
yeah, I was. I was.
You
I was
were
a Jersey
authentic.
girl.
Most of us were imports. So and it was most of the reporters were. It was mainly a bunch of young. I mean, most of the reporters were in their 20s. Small staff of, I don't know how many reporters there were, 8 or 10 or 12 or all told. It was pretty small. You were an editor. We overlapped for about a year, I guess. You came after I'd been there a year, and I stayed another year.
Yep.
And I mean, do you look back and think of that as the good old days or not?
Yeah, I do. I met some really great people I'm still friends with.
And
Yes.
yeah,
And also, I have to say, very smart people.
it-
Whatever issues we may have had, yes, whatever issues we may have had with the leadership there at the time, I think they hired extremely smart people. And that was a revelation to me to see journalists who were working at that level. And also just really ready to have a good time, which was also.
were we ever? Uh, in fact, I know of at least 2 of us who have quit drinking since then by way of reforming.
Oh, well, I hope we didn't add too much to that problem, but I imagine we probably did.
It didn't seem like a problem at the time.
Yeah, it didn't.
Yeah, we did. They were. It was funny because it was. There was a lot of talent there, and we were the young, scrappy competitor trying to fight the behemoth Asbury Park Press.
That's right.
Which partly overlapped with our circulation area, and I must say, pound for pound, I thought we did have a little more in the way of repertorial talent. So, needless to say, we lost, and they're still standing. The Daily Register is no longer with us. That's the way things go. But it was, I don't know. It was so. It was just a different world. I mean, it's probably hard to convey to people who were not part of that. Just one thing is like the relative lack of urgency. We put out a paper every night, but you knew you weren't going to have to write the piece until like 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. or whatever. And that is have you noticed this being an issue in the online world where, I mean, it's a criticism, right, that the competition to get stuff out there leads to bad, as soon as possible, as soon as the story breaks, leads to bad journalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely different now in a lot of respects. Although some things, it's funny. I was just thinking about this since we just came back from our annual conference where there's really stark differences, obviously. But some things really don't change, and that is that you introduce something new. Like I remember at the Register, zoning was a big thing at the time. Do you remember that? We switched into
the zoning was an innovation.
It was an innovation that had a lot of people upset and definitely negative, reaction to it. And it's funny because, that still happens now. And
we should explain, it consisted of, rather than put out a single newspaper to everyone, we divided the circulation area into 4 zones. The thing about New Jersey is it's wall-to-wall tiny municipalities. So like I covered both Freehold Borough and Freehold Township in all of their dimensions, and I was a total rookie. So, school board, cops, mayor, everything. And so the zoning consisted of you would take about 4 towns. Mine was Western Monmouth. And there would be an edition unique to that area. That would have a lot of the news that was in the paper in all the other zones, but we might put a Freehold story on the front page for the Western Monmouth edition or whatever, right? So that's the innovation you're talking about.
Yeah, and I remember when it was announced. I think that's one of the reasons I was hired. I'm not sure about you, but to come in and help with that. And I remember the reaction to it was, as only journalists can. Nothing ever is right for journalists when something new is introduced. At least at that time, there was a lot of griping about it. I think it tended to work. I'm not sure. Obviously, it didn't work ultimately.
Because, not well enough.
Yeah, the paper's not there. But I do remember. I remember the great comfort I took and actually enjoyment I took in the process, which was, reporters would go out and report, come back, write up their stories. You would edit the story and you would call the reporter over and work with them on the story. Then you would get to actually design the page and work with the layout folks, assuming they were in a good mood that night. And you got to see the ultimate end game, sort of very hands-on. And that was I thought that was a great time. I really enjoyed the beginning to end process that you did with that.
It was fun. And my role was, I had been a reporter there for a year. Once they started zoning, they made me an editor of one of the editions.
That's right.
So, and what you had basically was, your zone might affect what was on the front page, but the main thing that was your baby, if you were editor of a zone, was the B section of the newspaper, right? Because that you would totally lay out, decide what pictures, where they'd go, you'd choose all the headlines, and that was really a gratifying thing. And there's nothing quite like that in the online world exactly. I mean, there is design, there is a kind of a homepage layout, but there was a lot of room. There was a surprising amount of room for creativity, it seemed like.
Yeah, I think there is now, but it's just sort of translated into something else. If you put aside sort of social media and all of the ramifications of that, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but Just the actual creation of a story now. There's so many different tools and technologies to use to do that. And if you are smart as a reporter, you definitely have the option to get involved in as little or as much of that as you want to. So you could work very directly with designers. You can work with audience engagement folks. You can essentially learn as little or as much as you want. And I think that's probably one of the great freedoms that journalists have right now. I think that given the sort of the financial aspect of most news outlets, they're very happy to have somebody, and I don't think this has changed at all since when we were doing it. They're very happy to have somebody be a jack of all trades. And as you sort of move through journalism, you find your niche. You find out where your strengths are.
Right. Right. There was, so like when we were there, you would go out to report a story. If it was important enough, a photographer, one of our, I think, 2 staff photographers, would accompany you.
That was a big deal.
Yeah. It was a big story if there was a photographer along. Whereas now, certainly for an operation that size, you would just, my smartphone can take pictures that are good enough.
And video.
Yeah. And so now a journalist might, depending on the venue, be free to mix all that stuff together. Increasingly, they've been a little slow, it seems to me, to integrate video into print. And it's still often frustrating. You're like reading a description of something, and you're like, could you just save me the time and show me? It's on YouTube. Do an embed. But anyway, back then there was this really, really pretty strict division of labor and specialization. And so this is like, so young journalists, I guess, see this as a good thing that they can.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a little overwhelming at times, if anything. You're coming into a business at a time when it's going through this amazing transition, and all the great things and bad things that happen with that. And I think that it's a little overwhelming because you have to excuse me, my allergies are acting up here.
You're in Washington, and that can happen in Washington.
Whoa, came out of nowhere. But a young journalist comes out of, let's start with college, right? You come out of college with a degree in journalism. Now, at some of the smarter schools, they're integrating computer science into journalism. So you have a little bit of knowledge, at least, of development and coding. So you come in able to do that. Mm-hmm. If you don't, you have to, you find out very quickly that you probably need to learn a little bit of that in order to do your job better. Mm-hmm. And then you're thrown the deadlines that you were talking about earlier, which are constant. There are no deadlines anymore. It's 24/7.
Everything's a deadline. Yeah.
Everything's a deadline. You need to get up to speed very quickly on social media if you haven't already. Although I would assume most journalists in their 20s are pretty adept at that already. But you have to learn how to wield it in a different way if you're doing journalism.
You mean for purposes of promoting your own stuff and your website's stuff?
Yeah, you have to use it to sort of make a brand out of yourself so that people know who you are. You have to find and nurture sources, just as you would if you were a journalist using a phone.
Oh, so you mean you use social media sometimes to do the research?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you want to have people you know are trustworthy who are you're watching that you can follow. And that you can respond to and also use as sources and stories if you need to.
Yeah.
And then you need to deal with, when you actually are putting together a story, the millions of ways that you can put that story together. What are you going to use? Are you going to use video? Are you going to use photography? Are you going to use... we just came back from the conference and we're talking about how virtual reality is going to integrate into journalism now. Oh. It's stunning, and it sounds.
Wait, how is it going to integrate into journalism?
Well, it sounds Barbarella, but people are already doing it. The Des Moines Register worked with Dan Pacheco. Des Moines Register is a Gannett property, so it's a legacy media company, mm-hmm. which is, I think, pretty interesting. Work with Dan Pacheco from Syracuse University, who knows a lot about virtual reality. and they did a story on called Harvest, which was about generational um, um, underpinnings of a farm and the legacy of farms. And they did it in 3D using virtual reality, and it's stunning. It's just stunning. We showed it at the conference, and I think people were a little taken aback by how you could apply that. And it's where I'll send you a link to it. It's really worth it taking.
So you mean, is the viewer of it? The viewer of it is not like putting a helmet on and being immersed in a virtual world, right? The consumer of this journalism.
Yes,
but they in principle could be.
In principle, you could be. And when we first saw virtual reality use in San Francisco in 2009, which was Nani de la Pena showed us how she put together a story on an LA food bank actual incident. But the virtual reality was so bulky, people were walking around with these giant helmets on their head and getting very dizzy and nauseous. I mean, it was not a pleasant experience for the most part, but you could see where this was very compelling. People got very emotional about what they saw. Cue now, 2014, and the helmets, there's no helmets now. There's just glasses or just eye goggles that you put around and use a joystick. You're no longer...
And they seem to be overcoming the nausea problem, which is really serious.
It is.
Because of a modest delay in I think is the reason in the adjustment of the visual field. By the way, not to brag about what we used to call a scoop, but do you know when I wrote a piece about the coming virtual reality revolution? 1986 or something.
Yeah, I would believe that. You were thinking.
I was out there. I interviewed. I was Jaron Lanier. I talked to who coined the term.
Yep.
This was at the Sciences magazine, which, like almost every publication I've ever worked for, is no longer with us.
Yeah.
But anyway, so virtual reality, that's weird enough. Now there's certainly lots and lots of journalists who they just basically do print still. It seems to me. You go to Slate or something, and it's just mostly stuff written by writers. But is it more and more the case that it is in the hands of the individual journalist, like what the final composition of media will be? Video, audio, photos, text?
I think it depends on the outlet. I think in major media companies, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Let me just take a drink real quick. That might help.
I was going to offer you some of my water, but
thanks.
We're not really.
Reality, I might taste it.
Yeah.
If you're looking at the major media corporations, there's still that hierarchy, and sometimes the digital folks aren't even part of the conversation. The news conversation until much later in the process, which is wrong. But it's getting much better. But we had, almost 2,000 people at our conference, and it just shows. And I think 5 years ago we had maybe 1,000. So it shows that more and more companies, more and more organizations, more and more startups, there's a lot of startup media now, are doing things differently, thinking differently about digital, because they have to. It's not, it's a come to Jesus thing, because they're seeing that that's where the readers and users are going. So they have to. But there's also a large portion of this audience or these practitioners who are really excited about it, who've been waiting for it to become acceptable in the legacy media world. So I do see that there's new structures and new culture being formed too, because there's so many new startups. Vox is one of those. Recode with Kara Swisher is one of those.
Right.
They're thinking very differently about how you put together a news organization.
And those are both examples of what you kind of alluded to earlier, where journalists, partly through the use of social media at least, create their own brand. Ezra Klein was at the Washington Post. Kara Swisher and Walt Mossberg were at the Wall Street Journal. Then they started Recode. And that is really... I think a difference. I don't, there's always a temptation to exaggerate the differences. It was certainly the case that people would become stars at individual outlets and then they'd be able to write their ticket. They usually wouldn't start whole publications, but, they'd write their ticket. But it does seem to me now that social media maybe make it a little easier to establish some independent identity, independent of the thing, and maybe make yourself more marketable than you might have been otherwise. The flip side is, I think journalists are more and more expected to do the promoting of the pieces with social media. I mean, it used to be, wherever I was, the Daily Register, the New Republic, it's like you wrote the piece, you were done. The whole idea of working for an outlet was that they handled the promotion. They brought the eyeballs to it.
Yeah,
and that was nice. It was like Miller time. You have a beer.
I remember being at the Asbury Park Press, and the editors decided they wanted to use photos of the columnists and photos of the reporters, and everyone felt really their backs went up because, I'm not part of the story, I'm not part of the promotion, I just do the work, and it should be objective, and that's it.
Right.
You wanted to stay low profile, you felt as though that was your job. That's gone, and that's totally gone. And I think, to a large extent, to the betterment. I think the idea of objectivity has always been a, kind of a fuzzy one. I don't know that there is any true objectivity. I think it's nice to shoot for, but I honestly think that a journalist who's impassioned about a topic that he's writing about or she's writing about is going to, at some point, have that influence their story.
And that is another change. I mean, there still are outlets that try to insist that what they do is straight news reporting. Although, if you pay close attention, it's more analytical now. But it used to be back when we were at the Register. The New York Times, if it had something that wasn't strict reporting, it would be labeled news analysis.
That's right.
But now everything, most of it's supposed to be analytical because that's how that's the value they purport to add. Is we've got people smart enough to do analysis. This isn't just the AP breaking story. The other thing that is, so there's the kind of reporting analysis line has maybe blurred, but as far as the personal opinion, like reporting / analysis line, I think social media have made the blurring of that almost inevitable. It's like people all the time say things on social media now and in various places that 40 years ago, if they had said them publicly, probably would have gotten them fired because they were supposed to act like they were perfectly objective and had no views. At newspapers. And I guess this is just truth in advertising, but it certainly is a difference.
Yeah, and journalists also were very much like doctors in that it was a secret society that you never called out your fellow, your colleagues if something was wrong. There was very little of that I remember.
That's true.
Yeah,
there was not a way to snipe at your colleagues publicly, was there? I mean,
oh no, there wasn't, and you didn't do it anyway. I mean, you just sort of sat back and let others have at it. But that's changed a lot too, which I also think is healthy. I mean, I think if a journalism organization or a particular journalist does something that's particularly egregious, it's good that fellow journalists, make sure that they let folks know that this is not the way we want to do business, and we're going to let people know that. But it's a touchy thing, right? It goes overboard sometimes.
But it's funny, and this is kind of an example of that leads to another question about the difference between then and now, which is, I think just this morning I think it was Gawker did like an expose of Vice. I don't know if you saw this, but it was like they got a hold of some emails. Well, an apparently disenchanted former Vice editor who was there a couple of months basically tweeted some email excerpts where his superiors were saying, hey, when you run a story like this about a brand that it was like the NFL or something that we have a relationship with, you got to run it up the flagpole before you run it because, so this was about separation of church and state. You got your advertising, the business side here, and your reporting there. And there was this ideal that reporting would never be corrupted by considerations of advertising. But I remember being sent to write a piece for the magazine about some, like, what were they? I think they sold farm supplies or something. And it was totally because they were an advertiser. And I just said, I understand why this is happening, so I don't want my byline on this piece, and my byline didn't run in the piece. And I remember the guy, when I got there and to report the piece, he started talking about how he was going to review the piece. This is the guy I'm writing the piece about, and how he was going to review the piece. And I will say that the newspaper did not go that far. I said, no, you're not gonna review. And he called the city editor, Tinker.
Yeah, Tinker.
You remember Tinker?
Yeah. And
I could hear her over the phone saying, Robert is one of our best reporters, like trying to reassure the guy. I mean, it was total bullshit. She would have said that about, about even people who weren't great reporters. But anyway, the point is, I mean, the church-state line has always, has rarely been inviolable. But do you think it's like more corrupting or less now? I mean, now you have the official kind of sponsored content that is labeled with varying degrees of conspicuousness, right? Yeah. I sometimes think that the purpose of the Slate redesign was to fit that stuff in. And do you have a sense for whether like this is a better world or a worse world in that regard?
Yeah, I think it's a transitory world. I think that's the problem. Everyone is on media, at media all the time to come up with this silver bullet revenue model, the thing that's going to save journalism. Or I think hopefully folks have moved away from that and noted and seen that there are probably many of them, and they're popping up all over the place. And native advertising, which is essentially what you're referring to, is one of them. So there's going to be a lot of fits and starts as people try to figure out how to do this. How do we basically do advertising in a very different way, and do it in a way that readers can engage in, that we feel like we're offering something at least useful, and not seem as though we're pushing off sponsored or advertorial content as news. And I do think that it's going to take a while before everybody gets it right. The labeling on it has to be very clear, obviously, but also the content has to be good. I mean, it has to be something that really shows that it's worth our printing this or using this information, posting it in a very public way, in a very high-profile way, because we think it's useful to you in some way.
But are websites exercising discretion there? I had assumed that what they do is they say, look, if you'll pay us money, we'll put the thing out there, we'll call it a sponsored content, give it the headline you want, fill it out with the text you want. I mean, are you aware of... of course, there was always, discretion. I mean, the New Yorker, I think semi-famously, once refused to either run an ad where a kangaroo's testicles were visible or airbrush them out. So there's always been a kind of discretion, but, and certain kinds of ads they just wouldn't accept. That's always, because you had a certain kind of level of prestige you wanted to cultivate. But are you aware now? Are they kind of like passing judgment on the sponsored content?
Yeah, the difference with this now, and what makes this different is that they're actually working with the sponsors or the advertisers to produce this content. So it's no longer just you're handed the content and you throw it on a page. You actually sit down and figure out what works for our publication, what works for our audience, because otherwise it doesn't do either one of them any good. If they take completely, if they have no participation in what's going to be on the page, they're going to throw it up there. Nobody's going to use it. The sponsors aren't going to be happy. The media outlet's not going to be happy. This way, they think at least we make sure that the content is strong and that it's usable and that we make money from it. That's my dog. So excuse the.
Oh. Feel free to bring your dog on camera.
She may come on camera.
This would not be a new precedent at Blogging Heads.
Really?
Oh, my dog Fraser still has a Facebook page with several hundred friends that started with his appearance on Blogging Heads.
She may jump up at some point.
Okay. In a way, I'm wondering if that's not more pernicious. When you work, when you work with the advertisers to create content that makes it harder for readers to remind themselves that this isn't, the publication talking.
Yeah, and there's the
Right.
rub, right? Again, I think there's a lot of experimentation going on. Let's put it that way. And I
Yeah.
think that some of these things are going to shake out, and some will stick and some won't. This one happens to be a pretty. A lot of people are trying it, and there seems to be some advantages to it, and they're having some success with it. So
Hmm.
this one may work out, but I do think there is going to be that push and pull for a while until they kind of get it right.
Hmm. Now, there is this issue. The fact that there are members of your organization affirms that there are some people, I guess, more or less making a living in this business. But the pay, and God knows we weren't getting paid a lot at the Daily Register back then, but you could just about live on it. And certainly, if you got to a point where you were writing for kind of glossy magazines and stuff, um, you could make real money. And I mean, to give you an idea of how things have changed, now I don't know what places like Slate and the Atlantic are paying now. I think maybe at the Atlantic the standard thing is maybe $200 a piece, but the truth is they're all now finding so many ways to get free content, often philanthropically subsidized, that the average amount they're paying for a piece is way less than that. And it has to be because they're not making $200 per piece from advertising. So, but anyway, when Slate first started, I was writing for it. And do you know how much I got for a piece then? I mean, this was before the crash. This was back when they thought it would be like magazines and you could make money. I just wrote a piece once a month and I got $2,000 per piece. And that's at least, that's more than, I got to think that's more than 10 times what the average person is getting. Um, you would know better than I would. Is there actual hope here? I mean, who are these? Who are these people, and what kinds of people are managing to actually make a living? Like coming out of college and stuff. What are the skills that allow them to thrive in this environment?
Yeah, it's really hard. That's why when I was talking about, you know, our our sample student coming out of college, the smartest thing for you to do is to make sure that you have a computer science element to your journalism or a design. Anything that has to do with user experience really, really is helpful because then you're not only able to write, which is very important, and report, but you're also able to think more strategically about, okay, how do we get this out to folks? What will make folks read it? Um, if you can develop, even better, because it's very hard to find good developers. I think most media companies are struggling to make sure that they have people in place who can think, not only do the work that's in front of them, but think about how to scale for the next thing that
So
happens.
by develop, you mean what? Forging partnerships with other media, or
Oh, sorry, no. Developing meaning computer development.
computer development,
Yep.
which means what?
Coding, um, knowing something about user interface, user design. Uh,
But coding is like programming. I mean, is part of it just conversancy in a content management system? Like, underlying the Blogging Heads website is what do you call it? WordPress, the WordPress content management system.
yep.
And so, learning a it's a database. So you go into WordPress and you fill in blanks, and then what comes out is this website. And so part of it is that learning, knowing how the main content management systems work. That
Yes.
helps.
Yep. That helps a lot. Um, so I think if you have some of those skills going in, you have an opportunity to make more money because you'll first of all, when you come in, you'll be able to do more. It
Hmm.
won't just be the writing and reporting. Um, and second of all, you can probably find a niche for yourself somewhere that will, increase your salary a bit too.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, that hasn't changed at all. I mean, freelancers coming are constantly complaining about uh, how little they make. I mean, and a lot of them post things on spec, just the way we used to do a long time ago.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it's really, really tough for people who are trying to make themselves known in the online world, you don't make a lot of money. You don't. It's only when you start working for organizations that you can start to earn a paycheck, and admittedly, that's not a huge amount of money either.
And meanwhile, many of these organizations, it's kind of unclear whether they're going to be able to make it. I mean, there used to be a number of publications that were actually just making money hand over fist, whether it was a newspaper with a monopoly on a city, certain glossy magazines.
So high.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, at some point they got unrealistically high. And I think that's half of the problem is this yearning, for these golden days that just isn't going to ever return. And I think that's something that it's almost been a psychic break for a lot of journalists. They have to get over that.
And part of it is, being an established journalist used to be more secure, partly because there were fewer people nipping at your heels, because it was more like a fraternity almost. I mean, it was like, anybody who wanted to compete with you for a job, they had to work their way up the ranks. Whereas now, anybody, any smart, ambitious person using social media and so on, can in principle make themselves known as an available journalist in short order. And then they're a threat to you if you've already got a job, right? I mean, there's just more. It's all more porous, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, except from the point of view of somebody like me. It's so. But on this point, you mentioned layout as a skill that's important. You mean not just that you could on paper go, oh well, the picture should go here and blah blah blah, but knowing how to implement that on a content management system.
Yeah. Design is huge. The big example of this is Snowfall from the New York Times.
I didn't see that, but I know it's famous.
It's always held up as, a matter of fact, to the point where I think a lot of journalists or designers especially don't want to hear about it anymore.
What the hell was it? Was it a lot of beautiful pictures and text, or was it video? And what was the story again? What was it?
It was about an avalanche that killed a group of people, and it was told in a narrative way, and told using responsive design too, which is enabling you to look at it on all your devices.
Uh-huh.
But what was really beautiful about it was that as you read through the story, you scrolled through it vertically. I'm always very bad at this. This is up and down.
That looks vertical.
Yeah, thank you. And you also saw videos that you could click on. There were beautiful photos. So it was a very immersive experience, but also very, very linear. It was just beautifully done. And you'll see now if you go to a lot of sites have sort of picked up that kind of design. So that, I kind of forgot what the question was because I got so wrapped up in that.
Well, I was just, we were talking about design being a skill people need to cultivate, right. That it helps people to cultivate. And I was just asking you, what was the texture of this famous Snowfall thing?
So that really had an impact, I think. It won a lot of awards. I think a lot of designers really took that as an example of what you could do. And that to me is really exciting because I know that the New York Times has a lot of resources and a lot of places don't. But I think this isn't a case where you need to have a full staff of designers to work on this. I think it's the case of getting two really good talented people in your newsroom who are free to experiment. Mm-hmm. And they can do things like that. They can swap ideas about what's the best tool or technology to use for this to tell the story the best way. Mm-hmm. That's what's really exciting to me. That's what really keeps me going every day is the fact that there's so many new things cropping up, and there's so many people now who are excited about using those and translating them into storytelling.
And to get back to what we were saying about our experience at the Register, it's really a gratifying thing to do design. I mean, in our case, this was just like laying out the front of the B section, which you and I did every night, again, choosing the pictures, the captions, the headlines. And it may be hard to explain to people why it was just a good feeling when you looked at, there was an overall balance, there was a whole, there were books were written about how to do good newspaper design, how to have, an attractive layout. You don't want your headlines bumping into each other. You want smart, efficient headlines. It felt good, and I'm sure the same is true now when people have the freedom, when individual journalists have the freedom to not only create some of the content, but actually assemble it.
Yes. And I remember one of the pleasures of committing journalism back when we were working was going out with a photographer and having him do a photo shoot, or having her do a photo shoot, and coming back and looking at the spread of photos and really fighting. I remember fighting to get 4 photos or 5 photos on a page if they were all really good, so you could just maybe tell the story with photos instead of with words.
And you're probably fighting the reporters, among other people, or also fighting
usually fighting the editors above, because that was seen as, and the reporters too. You're right. Yeah. Now that I think about it,
they wanted their text in there.
They didn't want their text cut, and I imagine that still goes on. But
well, actually, space is infinite now, so it's not quite what it was. But I mean, online space is infinite in principle. But
yeah, and I do think there's much more of a there's less of a line of demarcation between word reporting, and visual reporting. I think that's the difference too with journalists now. They're much, much more involved in thinking about the design of a piece, because you have to. You're online. You need to think about how the piece is going to flow and what's going to keep people interested and keep them on the page in order to retain them.
Are there content management systems that are particularly conducive to creativity in this regard? I mean, I think, when Ezra Klein went from the Washington Post to start Vox, I think one important thing, he brought a tech person from the Washington Post, and I think there was this idea that there was something about their platform that made it easier to be creative and mix these elements together. Are there particular content management systems, or maybe actual kind of sites like Medium, which I still don't understand very clearly, that are particularly amenable to the creative, to creation in this sense?
Yeah, I think more journalists have left, more creative journalists and technology adept journalists have left news organizations because of CMSs. That's just a fact. CMSs, I'm sorry, suck for the most part.
So period. Content management systems just generically are more constraining. I didn't even realize there was an alternative. So what can you be on? What can a website be on other than a content management system?
Obviously WordPress was huge because it allowed people to very independently, do fairly complex stuff, and continues to do that. And then there's all open source that you can add on to that, which I'm not a developer. I'm far from a developer, but
plugins.
Yeah.
But there's something other than a content management system like WordPress that can be.
Well, no, I think what's happening now is folks like Ezra and his team are developing their own content management system.
So technically, it is a content management system, but it's a new kind.
Yes.
That
customized to what they need, and hopefully, they'll have success with that and can share what they've done. I'm sure they'd be happy to do that.
Yeah. Well, even what year was I at I spent a year blogging at the Atlantic, 2010. Was that WordPress or Movable Type? But anyway, no, it was 2012, so it's pretty recent. And, we had complete control of our space. You could embed videos, you could do, and man, was it laborious. I mean, it was really hard to figure out and there's the inherent complication of people using different kinds of browsers and so on. So CMSs are under that constraint. But yeah, it is, it's hard.
Yeah, one thing we have not been able to do well at O&A is we have a membership system, sort of a out-of-the-box CMS, and we use it, but it's not the best for us. We would prefer to be able to customize our own, but it takes so much work and so much money, and then you still have to scale it. You have to factor in the next 5 years, 10 years. Mm-hmm. So we've never done it. But I know that everyone has the same pain points when it comes to those. It's,
What's your sense of the role of writing skill? I mean, the common lament is that it's not what it used to be. I
You
think
mean
partly because you can't afford the layers of editors you used to be able to afford, but
you mean reporting or write or
I mean
actual?
actual writing. You don't see any deterioration there?
I think it's volume that's what's getting to us.
Yeah, how
There's
much you're
just
expected to do.
so much of it,
Yeah.
and you're overwhelmed all the time with information, and not all of it's good, and not all of it is well written. Um, that being said, I think if you look towards the sort of the folks that you would expect in media companies, you're going to find strong writing and you're going to find very strong reporting. It's just kind of trying to pick out, from everything that's out there, what's worthwhile and what's not. And then you'll find like a gem from somewhere that you never in a million years expected.
And that's the new thing, is that a gem that appears anywhere, can suddenly find a large readership, regardless of what platform it was originally
Right.
on.
Which is great. It's
Yeah. I mean, it has its pros and its cons, because I mean, the whole SEO, clickbait headlines, and has its pros and its cons. I mean, this is a huge difference, that publications have the information about how much individual articles are read. They used to not have that feedback.
Yep.
You knew how many issues you sold, period. Aside from that, all an editor or publisher had to go by was, what did they hear at the cocktail party about what people were reading? And as a result, they were getting like elite feedback, right? I mean, they were getting a certain level of feedback. It wasn't, so, and now it's changed. Now it's just raw numbers of clicks, and who knows who's clicking. I guess they know more and more, but it's a real shift. So, you weren't held accountable for the volume of readership of individual pieces, and I'm not sure that the consequences of the new system are entirely good. But
yeah, and now I think it's going to get more complex, because I think that what we're going to be looking for, or what we are looking for, but it's even harder to judge or to measure, is the impact your journalism is actually having. If you're doing stories, on public service stories, if you're doing investigative pieces, how do you know that they're taking effect outside of laws changing or something that's really tangible? And there's a lot of foundations right now that are looking to see how that happens, because they're putting a lot of money into journalism, and they want to see if what they're sort of funding is having any impact at all in society.
Right. I like to think that at the Register I played a role in preventing, at least at the time, the breakup of the Regional Reholt School District. The rich municipalities like Colts Neck wanted to pull out so that they wouldn't be subsidizing the poor students like in
I
Freehold
remember
Borough.
that. Yeah.
And I just worked hard to call attention to the actual consequences for the different communities, notably the poor communities. And I think I gave them some trouble, and the plan fell apart.
Yeah, and that's I think as a journalist you have to have that happen at least once a year, maybe. Be nice, because it keeps you going, especially the kind of pressure that journalists are under right now. It really is the reason why you're doing it when you come right down to it.
And it's I'm sure it's hard to remember that, given the pressure on people these days to just produce sheer volume.
Yep.
And this, leads us to where the fact that a lot of the more in-depth investigative stuff is now being produced by nonprofits, like ProPublica.
We had the Investigative News Network had 4 winners at our Online Journalism Awards, and they were all nonprofit. So Texas Tribune, ProPublica brought home, I think, 4 awards, maybe 5, for really great work. Center for Public Integrity, where I used to work, won something that I think they won a Pulitzer for too. So, it's definitely at least for investigative journalism, they're definitely having an impact.
And these places appear on these pieces appear on for-profit platforms, and it's one of the ways in which these for-profit platforms, Slate, The Atlantic, whatever, are keeping their head above water, is that more and more of their content is actually subsidized. And, that's a whole issue in itself. When you look at who's doing the subsidies, sometimes I would be happier about it than others. And people may disagree. But that's an interesting topic in its own right. Well, this has been fun. We didn't tell us, I'm trying to think if there's any, we didn't tell as many actual tales from the early days of the Daily Register.
I'm not sure I can.
I don't think we want to name names.
Some of them.
We don't want to name names.
We were much younger then. Even though I was a single mother at the time, we still had some fun.
We did.
Yep.
It was a great time. I remember looking up and thinking, I'll never have this again.
Yeah, I really had that feeling too. I mean, I went on to the Asbury Park Press, I think, after that. I'm not sure. No, I went to the Ocean County Reporter.
Ooh.
And I was editor there, which was basically a penny saver, I guess, at the time. And they were trying to turn it into something else. And then to the Asbury Park Press. And yet the Register is the group of folks that and maybe because it was so short, it was only a year. I think. And we worked those hours. It was
intimate. It was a small number of people. We hung out together.
Yeah.
And, it was like, I guess, and we had a competitor. We had the Asbury Park Press, and we wanted to beat them. And I remember beating them on particular stories.
And the shift we worked, or at least I worked, I think you did too for a time when you were editor, was the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. I'll never forget that.
Not only that.
And if you don't bond with somebody when you're doing that, I don't know how you do it.
Not only that, but when I became an editor, I became also a business writer, and I would do that in the morning. So I would work 10 to 6 a.m., go to the Y Swim, have breakfast at Denny's, and come back and do my business a few hours more, and then go to sleep, around 1 p.m.
Yeah. And you're totally leaving out the bar scene, so.
I didn't do it on a nightly basis. You're getting me mixed up with Andrew, who's quit drinking and wrote a book about his alcoholism. Did you know that?
Did?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It was the worst piece of luck ever. His book, I mean, not that this was the most tragic aspect of 9/11, but his book came out like a week or two after 9/11. You could not get attention for anything other than 9/11 a week or two after 9/11. And it was a good book. It's a book by Andrew Sheehan. Look it up. His father was the running guru, Dr. Sheehan, who was actually at the Register where his syndicated column was based. And
I'll have to look that up, and I've lost touch with a few of especially the guys. Now that I'm seeing you, I'm going to have to.
It would be fun. Anyway, we shouldn't get too much into this, but I will say, I do want to. We can do this off. We can take this off camera. I do want to say, now that I've mentioned Andrew's name, he was not. He was totally functional and a great reporter at the Daily Register. I think the alcoholism he writes about in his book, and I wish I could remember the name, is. I think he's talking about a later phase. Mm-hmm. But in any event, last time I talked to him or emailed with him, he was hadn't had a drink in many years.
Oh, good for him.
Yeah. Still, those were the days.
Ah.
Well, thank you, Jane. This has really been fun. Good luck. You're doing God's work. And maybe we'll catch up again on this site at some point.
I would like that. And sometime in person.
I get down there every once in a while.
All right. Let me know.
Okay. See ya.
Okay.